Hi, I'm John Lima, editor of Data Economy, and this is Frontline. Here with me I've got Mattias Ganslandt, President and CEO of Swedish data center services provider Multigrid. Mattias, thanks a lot for talking to me. We're nearly at the end of 2017. Has this year delivered what you expected to deliver to the Nordics data center region?
I think the year we have behind us almost is a very interesting one in many respects. It's a steady growth and we're seeing increasing interest from particularly the large hyperscale companies, and there is a lot of cloud moving into the Nordic countries. So yes, I think it's a healthy growth and a strong interest from the international players.
Okay, and then one of the biggest messages around the Nordics is around renewable energies, especially with Sweden. And in Stockholm, data centers, actually the heat is being used to warm some houses as well. What is the role of renewable energy in the data center space, and why is it becoming so critical nowadays?
I think it's a number of reasons why we're motivated to do sustainable solutions. So one is, of course, that it reduces the cost significantly. So in fact, through a combination of renewables and heat recovery, we're achieving very low net energy cost, which is of course important to the data center. I think it's also important because it reduces the commercial and financial risk of the company. So in terms of being able to operate in a city environment, to get the sufficient space, etc., it's very favorable to have sustainable solutions that are supported by the political system. I think it's also valuable with respect to risk, since we get easier funding through green financing, and that's adding another strategic motive from a commercial perspective. So I think there is a number of very strong advantages why we are pursuing a green strategy.
Okay, and then, well, we are in Oslo at the Data Cloud Nordic, and there was a keynote this morning, which I believe you didn't go because you couldn't, but one of the big topics was around governmental help in the data center play, and there was a bit of a catfight between some of the panelists around the Norwegian government. How would you compare the different governments in the Nordics, especially Sweden, Norway, and Denmark? What sort of job are they doing, and who's probably doing the best job?
Well, I think it's a common factor in the Nordics that there is a very, very strong political support for renewables and more generally sustainable solutions. And I think it's a little bit of an exaggeration to say that these cities or these locations compete with each other. It's more a question of exploiting these advantages when it comes to reaping these benefits or these fruits to be competitive at the global level. So it's more a question of whether you're able to compete with locations that have fossil fuels, no heat recovery, and other disadvantages.
So you live more in a regional data center hub, not a country sort of thing?
I think it's similar to the fundamental reasons why the Nordics had a fairly significant success in export markets with energy-intensive exports more generally, right? We had paper and pulp, we had steel. In Norway they have a lot of aluminium. Same reason that the hyperscale data centers could move to Scandinavia at a much larger scale than today, because the fundamental conditions for cost competitiveness is here. We have stable political systems, but we also have the advantage of very, very abundant supply of renewable energy. And in fact, Norway and Sweden has a common system that incentivize renewable energy production. So in any consumer, a data center in Norway or Sweden would contribute actively to more renewables in the system.
Okay, so energy stability is one of the most important things in the data center space then, according to what you just said and the previous answer as well. Do you think if a location nowadays, not a Nordic location, any location around the world, if a location cannot provide renewable energy, would they be at a disadvantage?
Absolutely. I think it's obvious from the last IPO of Switch in the US that the very fact that Switch is both having a very, very attractive situation with land, but also the access to renewables in the deserts in terms of solar and all other advantages is a very, very strong competitive edge of Switch in the US West. Same thing with the Pacific Northwest, where you have the hydropower driving hyperscale competitiveness in the Pacific Northwest. So absolutely, I think it's a competitive disadvantage today not to be able to provide sustainable solutions. And I think even more so in the years to come, because there is even more pressure on converting into sustainable solutions, because as the data center industry grows, there will be even more pressure both from consumers, so customers will require sustainable solutions, and from the policy side where regulators will ask for sustainable solutions.
Do you think it's possible that we're going to see some sort of taxation on the CO2 emissions of data centers?
I think rather that you see a lot of incentivizing of the green production rather than taxes on CO2, because it's a very tricky thing.
Taxes will mean more penalties as well.
Yeah,
So
I think to some extent that you already see that some customers are penalizing companies not doing renewable choices. So if you take the reports that have been coming out from Greenpeace for a number of years now on clicking green, in fact, they have actually made an impact, because companies that are in the category from Amazon to Microsoft, all the large players are now committing to 100% renewables, because they see an advantage when it comes to providing this to the end customer, that the end customer requires something which is sustainable and green. Not only hyperscale. Hyperscale is a great thing as well because it adds efficiency. But if you add renewables, you become competitive. If you don't, then you have to stand with the shame that comes with not being sustainable.
And then I guess if your logo goes next to one of AWS or Google or something in a Greenpeace rank like that, it's a very easy marketing tool.
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly.
And then one last question on renewable energy. How can data centers prepare for it? What sort of preparations do you have to have in mind?
I think the fundamental choice you have to do in the Nordics is to stay on the grid, because it's a very, very important strategy to be able to exploit both the scale economies of your solution. So rooftop solar would have problems with storing electricity to the winter in the Nordics. So rooftop solar or solar solutions is something that requires you to be much, much closer to the equator, further south. So on the Texan-Mexican border, for instance, it makes sense to do solar. In the Nordics, you have to do a combination of hydro and wind, which requires you to stay on the grid. Secondly, I think you have to stay on the grid for the reason that it's very, very difficult for the data center to actually make some sense of all the excess heat that comes out of the data center. So if you want to do this,
Sweden is quite a leader.
Yeah. So if you want to make a profit from your excess heat, then you have to stay on the grid, because that's where you can make the money. So in fact, at the moment, the market value of the heat that we're selling in Stockholm is actually higher than the electricity price. So in fact, it actually makes a lot of commercial sense, not only to buy renewables, but also to sell the heat.
What other sort of revenue streams do you see coming out of this? So we have heat now. What sort of revenue streams do you see in the future? New business
I think there are a lot of interesting possibilities. So one thing we are working on as the next generation of technology is to have the data center provide grid services. So not only heat recovery, but also grid services to the electrical grid. So those could be, in a situation where the electrical distribution is very, in a situation where there needs to be some backup resources. So the data center has a lot of redundant backup resources, for instance. We see a lot of demand for energy storage in the electrical market, so that renewables can be, matched to demand in a much larger extent if we actually store some of the electricity. So those are two possibilities.
So the data center could almost become like Elon Musk's dream of having that small electricity storage in the garage, and the data center becomes that in the future.
At a much larger scale. And I think, in fact, that the resources that are in the data center could be integrated to a much larger extent with a mutual benefit to both the grid and the data center, because ultimately we get a much more sustainable solution, but also a more reliable solution, because nobody benefits from a system that is unreliable. So that would be to the benefit to the data center as well.
That's very, very interesting. Yeah. And then one last question. What about Multigrid's plans for next year? What can we expect? Expansion,
so
acquisitions?
Our main strategy at the moment is to pursue a strategy of a sustainable large-scale or hyperscale cloud region in Stockholm. So we're going to be the first cloud region with heat recovery at hyperscale. So we're pursuing a strategy which involves building and building out a cloud region with a number of sites that are connected, much like cloud regions typically are, except that we add to this the benefits of the Scandinavian system with heat recovery and so on.
Are you going to be partnering with someone to do that?
This is going to be a venture for Multigrid, and we are of course we are of course partnering with others.
Okay, Mattias, thanks a lot for talking to me.
Thank you.
Don't forget you can follow Data Economy on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter, and also visit the website on www.data-economy.com.